To this day, one of the hottest topics in JJK is whether Gojo could have beaten Heian form Sukuna with no Maharaga. But let's be honest, that topic has been covered more times than Sukuna has made binding vows, so I've decided to put a much more interesting spin on it. In chapter 230, Sukuna taunts Gojo for not being able to open his domain. Sukuna basically said that Gojo was lucky not to be born in the same era as him, because then he would never have been called the strongest. So in this video, we're gonna see if that statement is actually true by exploring what would have happened if Satoru Gojo was born in the Heian era. I already know some people are going to struggle to comprehend that this video is simply a fun hypothetical, but guess what? I don't care, go cry about it. Also, I know some people will take Sukuna's statement as gospel because they're crazy glazers, but they are forgetting the fact that Sukuna said this thinking he had won. Sukuna continued to call Gojo ordinary just before his brain turned to soup and Gojo started beating his ass so hard Sukuna started crying for his mummy. So yeah, there is a very real discussion to be had here, but it is just a hypothetical, so if you disagree and it's actually for a valid reason, then that's fine. Also, no, Gojo being in the Heian era does not just make him Sugawara Michizane. They are completely different people with completely different levels of strength, and we don't even know if their abilities work the same way. Having the same technique does not make you the same person. Anyway, let's start off by seeing what Gojo would have been like in the Heian era, and then pitch him against the prime Heian era Sukuna to see who the real strongest would have been. Okay, we're gonna start off by quickly exploring if Gojo would also awaken in the Heian era. Now, when I made a poll asking if you want to see this video, a lot of people said there's no point because Gojo would just die before awakening, to which I am going to respond with, are you dumb? Sorcerers weren't just instantly killed as children because it was the Heian era. He could very easily grow up just as Uro Yorozu and all the other sorcerers did. It's not like Sukuna went around hunting children sorcerers, you know? If anything, he'd want them to grow up to be an actual opponent for him. The only way this would actually be the case is if Kenjaku killed him as a baby, and I'm pretty sure he wasn't doing that yet. Plus, if that did happen, Gojo would be dead and there would be no video, so for everybody's sake, I'm gonna assume that he actually grows up. Now, Gojo's soul and innate personality would remain intact, but he would likely be much less arrogant than he was in the Hidden Inventory arc. In our time, pre-RCT Gojo was still pretty much uncontested as the strongest, but in the Heian era that would not be the case. A sorcerer with a strong-ass domain, like Yorozu, would likely wipe the floor with Teen Gojo. Now, Gojo, being the absolutely insane natural talent that he is, awakened his reverse curse technique when he finally got humbled and put close to death by Toji Fushiguro. Considering the fact Teen Gojo in the Heian era would have much less need for humbling and have more experiences with tougher opponents, he would still be capable of learning reverse curse technique, auto infinity, red, and purple. Gojo's isolation in being the strongest would also likely still be a thing after awakening and learning infinite void, because he would then wipe the floor with pretty much everybody except Sukuna and maybe the vengeful spirits. The point of this is that his fighting style and desire to actually be challenged will remain intact. However, he will also have a more survival of the fittest mindset that comes with growing up in the Heian era. Our Gojo grew up so much stronger than anything else, hence why he was so arrogant and also why he was not living up to his own potential. Once Toji taught him that he wasn't truly the strongest, he was then able to awaken and reach his full potential. So yes, Gojo will be capable of reaching the strength he is now, and that's because he will have been actually challenged since birth. We have established Heian Gojo can reach modern Gojo's strength, and that his personality / mindset would be relatively similar, so it's now time to get into the most important point of the video. Not only can Heian era Gojo match modern Gojo's strength, he could potentially be much stronger, and I mean levels stronger. There are many reasons I think this, but before I get into them, I want to remind you that this is purely hypothetical because we know all about the Heian era. Any silly comments that still complain about this will be met with responses exclusively in rice ball ingredients because I cannot be bothered. Anyway, my main reason for thinking he can be stronger is simply because of how level Jujutsu was in the Heian era. Kenjaku, Sukuna, and Yorozu are obviously the best examples of how the Heian era was just a higher level, but after all these years the information was slowly lost. For instance, Yorozu suggests that she knows about Shrine, so Shrine's details were likely known in the Heian era. Sukuna also seemed surprised when Jogo wasn't aware of how Shrine worked, but then he realized even if there were records, a cursed spirit wouldn't have access to that information. So now I'm going to run through all of the lost abilities that were present in the Heian era and why Heian Gojo could potentially learn them. The first major ability, which was considered impossible in modern times until Sukuna revealed it, is an open domain barrier. Both Sukuna and Kenjaku, two Heian era sorcerers, have open domain barriers. And it's not like Sukuna and Kenjaku were training buddies or anything, so it's unlikely that one of them taught this to the other. They would have learnt it completely independently from each other, suggesting that open barriers barriers were slightly more common knowledge in the Heian era. I'm not saying they were common knowledge or many people could use them, but they were definitely a thing. And no, just because Kenjaku taught Sukuna how to split his soul does not mean he taught him other stuff. That was purely for Kenjaku's plan and part of their binding vow. Considering how many sorcerers fought Sukuna in the Heian era and how widely known his strength was, the fact that he has an open domain barrier would surely be widely known too. In modern times, Gojo only became aware of the possibility of an open barrier during the fight, or at most a month before the fight. However, if Satoru Gojo grew up in the Heian era knowing it was a thing, not only would he be more prepared to deal with it, but there's also a good chance he could learn it for himself. There is no denying that Gojo's level of genius for Jujutsu is contested only by Sukuna. Higuruma, Yuta, and Yuji could also be contenders, but we haven't really seen enough of that from them yet. In the middle of their fight, Gojo constantly adjusted the properties of his barrier, and Sukuna did the same. Now, according to Kusakabe GPT, this should be completely impossible, but Gojo is simply that guy. If he can learn to change conditions mid-battle, imagine if he had prior knowledge of open domain barriers and the time to perfect it. If Sukuna and Kenjaku can do it, then best believe Gojo does have the raw talent to do it, given the time and knowledge. I'll expand more on this later, but Gojo would straight up low diff that fight against Heian era Sukuna if he also had an open domain barrier. But for Sukuna's sake, let's just assume that he can't use it for now. He will still know about it going into a fight with Sukuna, meaning he will have time to plan a strategy as opposed to improvising mid-fight. Now, I'm not saying this will mean Gojo can win, but it will give him better odds. Now, this next one is a lot less simple, since it is unconfirmed whether Sukuna actually knew this ability already or if he learned it from Gojo during the fight. But if healing a burnt out curse technique was also common knowledge in the Heian era, Gojo will know that there is a limit to how often it can be done and change his strategy accordingly. I think this one is much less likely to be widely known, and there's a good chance that Gojo was straight up the one to invent the technique, but who knows? Simply put, if he knew about the limitations, he would not have pushed himself to the point of losing his domain. Again, I'm not saying this means he will win the fight, but it will give him better odds, and we are going to discuss this more later. Now, before I fully put Heian Gojo and Heian Sukuna against each other, I'm going to first clarify some key differences between current Sukuna and actual Heian era Sukuna. First off, he'll have no 10 Shadows technique and no vessel. He is just him. Then there is the fact that he is already in Heian form, meaning higher output and better hand-to-hand capabilities, but it also means that Sukuna will not have a backup healing plan. There'll also be more of an information gap on Sukuna's part. He won't know what Infinite Void does in detail, nor will he know that touching Gojo actually protects you from it. And this is simply because anyone who has been trapped in Infinite Void won't live to tell the tale, and Gojo won't exactly be walking around explaining it to people. Of course, this is assuming that Gojo uses a closed barrier as opposed to an open one, because onlookers of an open barrier will be able to tell what's going on. And finally, there is Kama, Toke, and Hiten, although we have zero clue about what Hiten does, so I'm not even gonna guess, because the odds are Infinity completely renders them both useless anyway. So now that I have covered Heian Gojo's potential and Heian Sukuna's differences, it's finally time to pitch them against each other and see who would actually be crowned as the strongest. Because there are lots of hypotheticals and assumptions involved, I'm gonna split the fight into different scenarios. For scenario 1, we are assuming that Gojo has learned how to use an open domain barrier, and that is literally the only assumption we are gonna go off, because if Gojo does have an open domain barrier, literally everything else becomes irrelevant. The fact of the matter is, Gojo will just low diff that fight. Gojo and Sukuna's domains are equal in terms of refinement, and their guaranteed hits cancel out. Without a physical barrier for Sukuna to target, he cannot break Gojo's domain, meaning Gojo can still use Infinity and the rest of the Limitless technique. This means that they've got to hand-to-hand it until one of them does enough damage for the opposing domain to fail. And in a hand-to-hand fight with Infinity active and no Maharaga, Gojo whoops Sukuna's ass 10 out of 10 times. I mean, we have literally seen it happen, there is no denying this. It really doesn't matter how many arms or tools Sukuna has. With Domain Amp being the only way to land a hit, Sukuna really just gets cooked. Sure, Sukuna's Heian form in theory increases Malevolent Shrine's output, but there has been nothing stating it would improve the actual domain's refinement. It's very simple. If Sukuna cannot outright destroy Gojo's domain, he just gets low diff. I mean, here, let me just show you what it would look like, okay? Now for scenario 2, we're going to assume that Gojo does know about the open barrier, but he cannot use one for himself. We are also going to assume that neither Gojo nor Sukuna had prior knowledge on healing a burnt out curse technique. And yes, in case you're wondering, Gojo will get some kind of assumption per scenario, like knowing about the open barrier, because without it, it just becomes normal Gojo, which defeats the whole point of the video. Due to Gojo's personality being much the same and him not knowing about the limitations of curse technique burnout, this scenario should play out very similarly to their actual fight, despite knowing about the open barrier. If Gojo somehow makes it past the first clash, he will still keep trying to expand a domain until he completely burns out. Now, anime fans, please try not to get too excited when I say this, but we're actually gonna do some scaling real quick. Utahime's boost brought Gojo to 120% output, but Gojo's own hand signs and chants pushed it up to 200%. So let's assume that Heian Sukuna's output with hand signs and chants also allows for an 80% increase in output. Considering Gojo's wounds were deep but not fatal against Megana, it's likely an 80% increase from Heian form Sukuna would at very least render Gojo incapable of fighting. And in that case, Sukuna does just win. However, if Gojo can somehow survive long enough to use Falling Blossom Emotion or Simple Domain and then heal his curse technique, he does have a chance. Let's assume that the first two clashes are just about survivable for Gojo. Gojo will not have Prison Realm experience, so he cannot reduce the size of his barrier. But at the same time, Sukuna cannot deactivate the Sure Hit inside of Gojo's barrier to increase output outside of the barrier because he doesn't know he can touch Gojo to survive it. Now let's assume Gojo's loss of protection equals Sukuna's loss of output. Sukuna is still in Heian form. He still gets that 80% boost. Not only does this mean he can tank more damage, but it also means he can make up for the output loss so that Gojo will lose every single domain clash he gets into. Basically, Sukuna wins in this scenario low to mid diff. Now this final scenario follows the same assumptions as the previous, but this time both Gojo and Sukuna already know how to heal their curse technique and they know about the limitations. Now this knowledge could completely change Gojo's approach to combating Sukuna since he won't want to constantly try and reopen his domain and eventually burn out. Now the first domain clash would pretty much go the same way in order for Gojo to test the waters and see if this domain can beat Sukuna's. After realizing their domains have equal refinement, but Sukuna wins from the outside, one of two things will happen. Either Gojo will get instantly shredded by Malevolent Shrine, which I don't think is likely, or Gojo survives just long enough to heal his curse technique. Since he already knows how to do this, he would likely only have to survive for a few seconds and then use blue to exit Sukuna's domain. Now Gojo is not dumb. If he knows that constantly healing his curse technique will destroy his brain and remove Infinite Void, he will not do it any more than necessary. And remember that Gojo's speed with blue is levels faster than Sukuna, so much so that it's mistaken for teleportation, so he can easily exit an open domain. If Gojo aims to simply avoid Malevolent Shrine for the duration of the fight, Sukuna will be forced to give up on catching Gojo inside of his domain. Of course, Sukuna could fix this issue by enclosing his domain in a barrier, but then he can't break Gojo's domain and will end up with a result like scenario 1. If Gojo does use this strategy, he again low diff Sukuna, but that's only if Gojo chooses to fight this way and if he can survive Heian Sukuna's domain for long enough. Overall, I'd give this scenario an even 50-50 between them because I can see it going either way. Given that Sukuna had Heian era knowledge and info on Gojo, whereas Gojo had jack shit, it's clear to see why Sukuna vs modern Gojo would almost always go Sukuna's way. But despite the information gap and Maharaga, Sukuna was still surprised at how close that fight actually turned out to be. Remember, Sukuna had a plan, whereas Gojo was improvising and still made the fight go way longer than Sukuna expected. After all, Sukuna thought he had won in chapter 230, but Gojo ended up just being him. Although not every scenario goes this way, Heian era Gojo overall just has better odds than a modern era Gojo. And the most significant difference was definitely the possibility of an open domain barrier. Pair Gojo's crazy natural talent for Jujutsu with prior knowledge of open domains and the time to learn it, and I genuinely believe Gojo straight up low diff Sukuna. But again, these are all just hypotheticals. The point is, his odds are just much better in the Heian era. Therefore, Sukuna was just wrong. I mean, if anything, Sukuna was lucky that Gojo wasn't born in his era. Giving Gojo access to all of that high-level Jujutsu knowledge would simply make him far more challenging than current Gojo ever was. Anyway, that pretty much wraps up the video. I know some people will really like this video, and some people will absolutely despise it, but at the end of the day, I made the video for fun and because I wanted to, and I shall continue to do exactly that with every video I make. But anyway, please do not forget to like and sub, feel free to join the Discord and follow me on Twitter, links below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you very soon to discuss what the f*** is going on with Gojo returning.